Hello Internet, and welcome back to my Ultima Retrospective series. I was so glad to see the overall positive response from the last video, and I'm trying to take into account some of my aforementioned issues, especially as far as audio goes. I switched recording methods and hopefully it works better this time. I apologize for how long it's taken to try to get this one out. Schoolwork and other family tasks have taken more time and effort than is expected. And of course, unpaid YouTube work for a channel with less than 20 subscribers is kind of, taking the back burner. But I hope you enjoy this longer form review, and again, I welcome and encourage any and all feedback. After the unexpected commercial hit that was a Calibeth, Richard Geary had set his sights on a much more ambitious project. As opposed to a Calibeth's transition from hobby project to commercial product, Ultimatum, as it was originally titled, was envisioned as a commercial project from the start. The name was shortened to simply Ultima after it was discovered the name was already in use by a board game company. I know this isn't really relevant, but I do like going down these rabbit holes, and I haven't seen this mentioned anywhere else. It turns out that Ultimatum, the board game, was actually about Cold War going hot and nuclear warfare, and it actually seems to be semi-rare, as I haven't heard of or seen any evidence of a new version produced since 1985. Anyways, back on the Ultima track. This is Ultima Retrospective after all, and not board game retrospective. For the production of Ultima 1, unlike a Calibeth, Geary had help to produce the game itself. He was helped with the coding of the game by his good friend Ken W. Arnold, who knew assembly and used that to code the tile system for the overworld, marking the first CRPG to use assembly code and the first commercial game to use tile graphics to display the surroundings, which is all the more common nowadays in 2D games. It turns out, also, that the original programmer for Rogue is also named Ken Arnold, but these are two completely separate people, both with massive influence in the early video game industry. Ken would continue to work on Ultima games until 1989, moving to composition for Ultimas 3, 4, 5, and 6. He also had a cameo in 5 and 6 as Sir Kenneth, canonically the composer of the ever-loved Stones and the court musician for Lord British. Besides the assembly code that Arnold wrote, the game was written mostly in BASIC, with many of the subroutines for dungeons and the sites lifted directly from a Calibeth, which is evident by the similar appearance of monsters, but more about that later. The game was finished entirely during their freshman year at UT Austin, and was published in 1981 for the Apple II. Zero would later re-release it for the Atari 8-bit line of computers, and Origin Systems would completely recode the game in assembly in 1986. This version was re-released for the Apple II, C64, and DOS. There were also more tailor-made versions for the Apple II GS and some obscure Japanese microcomputers. This review will focus mostly on the 1986 DOS release, as that is A, the most easily accessible, and B, considered to be the best graphically of any, besides the obscure Japanese releases. I was also able to get the 1981 release working, so I will highlight the differences whenever possible. The story is, well, murky at best. For the research on this one, I consulted 4 different Ultima game manuals and multiple wikis to try to piece together what was even happening here. Naturally, the game tells you next to nothing about the story, almost at all even towards the end, but I can forgive it that for the disk space. I mean, honestly, the ROMs I got for the original version were 2 140 kilobyte sides of a single disk, and the game itself only used 140 kilobyte side, the other was for saves. Even the 1986 recode wasn't much bigger, and the GOG download is 10 megabytes. But 9.7 of those megabytes go to DOSBox, the installer, the manual, and the desktop icon. The manual takes up 800 kilobytes, over 4 times that of the game itself. What's more impressive about this whole situation is it took me about 12 hours to beat the game. In reality, you could take much more to beat it, and play through it if you really wanted. I think that may be one of the most impressive disc size to hour played ratios nowadays. I mean, Now that we see it, we see these 100 plus megabyte games, and I'm not sure we really get the value out of them that we used to get out of these old titles. Now, I really couldn't find any scans of the original manual. The best I could find was some pictures from an eBay listing for the original game. Too bad the $1,000 was what it was costing, otherwise I might have got it. As far as I could find about the original manual, the game's plot wasn't mentioned at all. It was more just a guide on how to get the game running. The 1986 manual, however, explains a little more about what is actually going on. It says something about Mondane sending monsters to attack Caesarea and how Lord British wants to unite Caesarea under one kingship or something, but this isn't really much more help. The Ultima 2 manual isn't much help, as that whole game really muddies up the canon more than anything, as you'll see later on. But I'll address that in my YouTube review. The Ultima 3 and 4 manual is much the same. We really get a fleshed out story in the Ultima 5 book of lore. I think this is pretty cool, so I'll spend the time to read it myself. At the time British arrived at Shamanows, quote, the manual also explains how Lord British arrived in Caesarea. A native lad was growing up in Caesarea, being trained in the ways of sorcery. He was a moody youth, given to sudden rages and fits of despondency. To offset the latter, he would take his dagger into the woods and hunt, leaving his prey to rot where they fell. He would return to his manner restored, strong in the confirmation of his power over life and death. His name was Mondane, and Mondane's strange ways were a constant worry to his father, a busy, much respected mage. When Mondane was 15, his father took a stand. Thou shalt take a year off from magic, Mondane, his father said, to improve thine attitudes and develop thy virtues. I have arranged for thee to live with thy brothers in the abbey, where thou shalt practice compassion and humility. Learn thy lessons well, my son, and this ruby gem, which harnesses the power of the sun, shall be thine. Mondane said nothing. The next night he slew his father and took the gem, for he was ready for the power, and his father was in the way. At the same time as Lord British was gaining a reputation for fair and honest governing over his provinces and attracting attention for his startlingly innovative ideas, Mondane was using his father's gem against itself to produce a black jewel that would render him his evil immortal. Success meant gaining even greater power over the minions of darkness. As terrors wrought by Mondane caused increasing unrest and dismay across Caesarea, British's ideas for unity of the city-state became more and more appealing. But the time was not quite ripe, for the widespread evil was beginning to take a tremendous toll. Something new was needed, thought British. He absently reached for the silver serpent he wore about his neck. Touching it in contemplation, he envisioned the kind of hero Caesarea needed to deal with Mondane. Within days, a stranger arrived in Caesarea. With utter devotion to truth and good, the stranger grew into a hero capable of facing Mondane. The only thing that the Ultima 6 and 7 manuals add to this is that the stranger you play in this game is the same character as the avatar of Ultima 4s and later. It isn't really apparent from any of the manuals, but Mondane somehow traveled back in time and set up his fortress there, which just muddies the whole timeline and canon even worse. While it's obvious that a lot of this manual work is obviously revisionist history and probably is, as far as I know, most of this is a story that Gary had originally intended. Apparently the maps and world were pulled directly from his current D&D world, and I'm sure the story was as well. For the game itself, you don't really get much, but it's all well and good. I looked all this up because, well, I'm a massive nerd, and Ultima fanatic, but honestly, really all you need to know when you're playing the game is, wizard bad, go kill. Character creation is much the same this time around, except that you get to choose a race, class, and gender. These only really affect stats. As far as I can tell, class, race, and gender have no effect on what weapons or armor or spells you can use. Once you create a character, it drops you back to the main menu, where you can choose which character to play with. You have 4 up to 4 saved at a time. You're dropped into the game in the middle of a field, and this is where the graphics come to bear. In the DOS remake, there are pretty looking EGA graphics, and this is just one of the many quality of life improvements that came with the remake. The enemies are not only well represented on the screen, but also animated. The flags on castles and towns also move. The dungeons are almost exactly identical to a Calabeth, with only a few additional enemies added. So it plays out really just as a more fleshed out Calabeth. You go to town to buy food, weapons, armors, and more, and talk to kings to get quests. Besides the food that you need to not drop dead instantly in this game, you need to visit a lot of different towns to find what you want. There's a bunch of stuff here too, but I just wanted to get the cool rides. They have all the normal stuff: horses, carts, rafts, hover cars, space shuttles. Wait, those last two don't belong in a fantasy world? You mean Gandalf didn't fly around in a DeLorean in style? I mean, we thought the Eagles were a walking plot hole. Imagine if the Fellowship could have just dropped the ring out the space shuttle in an evening. Anyways, yeah, you can buy hover cars and space shuttles, and it is pure awesome. You might think that once you get enough gold to buy these luxury items, the game will suddenly become easy, but it isn't. The game is actually really hard, and you'll end up grinding a lot in the overworld and dungeons for gold, and constantly going in and out of dungeons to keep your hit points up. The dungeons are almost exactly like they were in a Calabeth, but I find them to be much easier to get around, and I spend much less time in them. I would still run into times where I'd get several levels deep in a dungeon for a quest and then die before I'd get out, but I blame that on myself for not being patient and trying to rush to the finish. I think the game kinda expects you to grind out hit points and use that to extend your playtime. And yes, you gain hit points by killing enemies in dungeons and then exiting it. Other stats you gain by reading different signposts around the world, and the strength is increased by various kings for completing quests. I pretty much just ground up to 1000 HP by exiting, saving, and going back in, as HP was really the most relevant thing for survival. Purchasing a massive amount of charges of ladder up and down spells also made life a lot easier, and thank goodness this game has saves. It may be fairly simple, but it took me about 10 hours to beat, and I died constantly. It was better most of the time just to reload the save instead of resurrecting with back to 99 gold and HP. Once you've had your fun mowing over the Loch Ness Monster with Luke's speeders and picking up blasters next to random signposts, you can get to that part we've all been waiting for. Space. There's 3 things you need to go to space. A shuttle, a vacuum suit, and a butt ton of gold coins. The gold is necessary because every time you dock at a space station, they charge you 500 gold for refueling. No matter how much fuel you need. Guess they just always use that flat rate. Then you choose a spaceship to fly. Whatever you do, don't fly around space with the shuttle. Only use it for takeoff and re-entry. It has both very low fuel and shields, and as such you won't be able to survive very long. The 2 other ships docked at the station can be used for combat. One has low shields and high fuel, and the other has high shields and low fuel. I chose to use the high fuel one, because as I found in all my tests, you're much more risk of using up all your fuel than actually getting hit and having your shields destroyed. How you move at space itself is not immediately clear, and if you don't know what you're doing, you won't be able to do anything. There's a discrete process here, and once you figure it out, you can beat the space segment no problem. After you pick your spaceship, which follows a very precise and tedious docking process. I mean, precise. You have to get this thing as slow as possible and line it perfectly up, otherwise it'll just bounce right off. You pull up the sector map screen by pressing I. The plus icons represent star systems that have space stations in them. Good if you need to refuel mid-trip, and the H's represent star systems that have enemy ships in them. Once you decide which system you want to go towards, you switch back to the top-down view and get your ship moving in that direction. Then you press V to switch to a front view, and H to hyperspace to the next system over. Kill enemies, refuel occasionally, forking out that 500 gold pieces each time, rinse and repeat. I mean, speaking of enemies, these are TIE fighters? I know Mondane was already super evil, but since when did he sign a treaty with the Empire? I didn't see this in the Book of Lore. I have another theory about Mondane, but this isn't Mondane ramblings. This is a retrospective for you one. Once you shoot down 20 enemy fighters, which takes a long time. you become a space ace. Don't worry, the game does tell you when this happens. You won't have to start ticking off fighters and cutting notches into your CRT. Apparently, the princesses imprisoned in each king's dungeon are the only people that can tell you where a time machine is. At least the game tells you this. At some point, I think. I really have to go back and look. I really don't remember. Wait a second. Isn't Lord British supposed to be some enlightened ruler wishing to unite the lands of Cesaria and standing for what is good and right in the world? I guess your system of morality doesn't discuss the enslavement of innocent young girls in your dungeons. Well, to break her out, this game starts the greatest Ultima tradition of all time. Stabbing Chuckles the Jester in cold blood. No, really. Every 3 freaking steps I take, Chuckles yells, "I have the key!" And I know you're supposed to steal it from him or something, but I just stab him for it and mow down all the guards in my way and get her out of the castle ASAP. Once you link to the past or butt out of prison, she tells you where the time machine is. Before you can use it though, you need to make sure you've got 4 gems from various kings by completing quests for them. Good luck knowing that without trying to use the time machine first. Once you're ready to jump in, you put the gems in and bam, you're taken back to Dane's fortress. I guess more of a room of solitude. Here the game really doesn't tell you something important. You need to go up to the gem and press G to destroy it. Otherwise, Mondane won't stay dead. You take a few hundred hit points when you do that, but he really doesn't hit you, so it's not a huge deal. The battle against him isn't too hard. I just zapped him with my phaser a few times and he ran until I cornered him and whacked him to death. After he dies, apparently the time period or Pocket Universe or wherever Mondane's fortress is collapses, and you'll eventually end up at Lord British's castle, where he thanks you and pledges all of Cesaria to your service. I don't think everyone in Cesaria is too happy about this, but that's about 7 games away from being addressed. Trust me, you'll know later. All in all, I'd have to give this one a positive review. Although some things were annoying, the game didn't usually tell me what was going on and is often grindy, as early RPGs are. I enjoyed playing it. The mix of fantasy and sci-fi was interesting and served to mix up the gameplay in a way that was awesome once you figured it out. I definitely recommend the 1986 DOS Recode, or the Apple II one for that matter. Even on the Apple II, it looks and runs much better than the original release. Plus, this version is the most widely available and it's natural for people to use it. As far as the mythos goes, the game itself does a pretty crappy job explaining what's going on. But it isn't really too convoluted, and it was fleshed out later on retroactively. I would recommend this one to fans of the genre and the series especially. It's a fun trot and well worth one's time. I would recommend this to young players as well, as it offers even more easy to grasp gameplay than Calibeth. Just watch out for the high difficulty. If you made it this far in the video, I'd like to thank you for watching. Maybe it's just my ADHD mind and thought process, but this video and script took way longer, and it ended up being way longer than expected. I'd expect the videos to be longer from here on out. I want to try to continue to improve on my format and skills, and any feedback appreciated. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time for Ultima 2, The Revenge of the Enchantress.